she was 19 and alone. Her father had been dead 11 months, and the family who'd promised to look after her had sold every acre he'd ever walked, every fence post he'd ever set, every tree line he'd ever planted, and they'd sold it all for next to nothing, pennies against what the land was worth, because they wanted it gone, and they wanted her gone with it. She had $43 in a leather coin purse her father had stitched by hand, and she had no family left who would claim her, and she had no plan except to keep moving until the moving made sense. And with that $43, she bought the one plot of land in the entire valley that nobody wanted, a steep, tilted acre and a half on the north side of Harlan Ridge, with a collapsed root cellar and a cabin so far gone that the county assessor had crossed it off the tax rolls and written the word "condemned" in red pencil across the deed. But what nobody knew, not the assessor and not the county clerk and not the family who'd thrown her out, was that beneath the hearthstone of that cabin, her father had hidden something years before she was born, something he had always meant for her to find. And it would change every single thing about the life she thought she'd lost. If you haven't yet, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Her name was Ilara Wynne, and she was born on the 4th of March in a 2-room house on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range. The only child of a man named Thomas Wynne and a woman named Catherine, who did not survive the birth. Thomas was 31 years old when he became both a father and a widower in the same hour, and the midwife who delivered Ilara said later that she had never seen a man hold a child the way Thomas held that girl. Not like something fragile, but like something he had been waiting for his entire life, and now finally understood. He was a woodworker by trade, a man who built furniture and repaired wagons and could look at a piece of timber and tell you what it wanted to become. He had come west from Pennsylvania at 22 with a set of hand tools that had belonged to his own father and a belief that if you worked carefully and honestly, the world would eventually make room for you. He built the house himself, every joint and beam, and he built the cradle Ilara slept in. And he built the small pine box they buried Catherine in on the hillside above the creek, where the wild columbine grew thick in June. Ilara grew up in sawdust and silence, and the particular warmth of a house where one person loves another without reservation. Thomas did not remarry. He did not send her away to be raised by relatives. He kept her with him in the shop from the time she could sit upright, and by the time she was 4, she knew the names of every tool on his bench: the draw knife and the spoke shave, the brace and bit, the coping saw, the number 4 smoothing plane with the rosewood handle that he kept sharper than any blade in the county. By 6, she could joint a board. By 8, she could cut a dovetail that Thomas said was cleaner than most he'd seen from grown men, and he was not a man who gave praise lightly. He taught her to read grain, to feel the difference between heartwood and sapwood with her fingertips, to understand that wood remembers the tree it came from and will always try to move back toward the shape it held when it was alive. He taught her to sharpen a chisel on an oilstone until the edge would shave the hair from her arm. He taught her to measure twice and cut once. And he taught her that patience was not the absence of action, but the presence of attention. And she carried that sentence inside her like a second heartbeat for the rest of her life. There was a woman in town named Margaret Soren, a widow of 63 who ran the dry goods store and kept a kitchen garden that produced more food per square foot than any farm in the valley. Margaret had known Catherine before she died, and she took it upon herself to teach Ilara the things Thomas could not: how to preserve food, how to sew a seam that would hold through a winter of hard wearing, how to read weather by the behavior of birds and the color of the sky at dawn, how to make a poultice from yarrow, and how to set a bone if no doctor could be found. Margaret was spare and direct, and she did not soften her instructions for a child. She expected competence, and she got it. Because Ilara had been raised by a man who expected the same. On Ilara's 12th birthday, Margaret gave her a folding knife with a bone handle and a blade of carbon steel that held an edge beautifully, and she said only this: "A woman who can cut her own path doesn't need to ask permission to walk it." Ilara carried that knife in her coat pocket every day from that morning forward, and she was carrying it still on the day she was cast out. Thomas Wynne was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one. He owned the 40 acres around his house and shop, land he had bought piecemeal over 15 years, paying cash for each parcel as he earned it. He also owned, and this was something Ilara did not learn until much later, a second piece of property on the far side of the valley, an acre and a half on the north face of Harlan Ridge that he had bought when he was 24, 2 years after arriving in the territory, for reasons he never explained to anyone. The ridge property was steep and shaded, and the soil was thin and rocky, and nobody in the valley understood why Thomas had wanted it. He had built a small cabin there in his first year of ownership, a single room with a stone hearth and a plank floor, and he had used it occasionally as a retreat, a place to go when the grief for Catherine became too heavy for the walls of the house they had shared. But over the years, the cabin fell into disuse, and the county eventually stopped assessing it. And by the time Ilara was 15, the property existed only as a line in Thomas's personal ledger, a notation that read, "Harlan Ridge, 1.5 acres, cabin, root cellar, for E." Thomas died in the winter of Ilara's 18th year. He had been ill for months, a cough that deepened and thickened until it became something that lived in his chest, like a second creature. And he worked through it as long as he could because he was a man who believed that work was the answer to almost everything. Ilara nursed him through the final weeks, sleeping on the floor beside his bed, keeping the stove fed, reading to him from the Bible he kept on the shelf, though he was not a particularly religious man. He died on a Tuesday morning with the light coming in through the east window and his hand in hers, and the last thing he said to her was, "You know where everything is." She thought he meant the shop, the tools, the accounts. She did not yet understand that he meant something else entirely. Thomas had no siblings, but Catherine had a brother named Horace Platt, who lived 2 counties east, and who arrived for the funeral with his wife Lenora and their grown son, Gerald. Horace was a man of 50 who sold farm equipment and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who has never doubted his own importance. He had not visited Thomas in over a decade, and he had met Ilara only twice, both times when she was very small. But he stood at the graveside and wept convincingly, and told anyone who would listen that he intended to honor his sister's memory by looking after her only child. Ilara watched him and said nothing. She had her father's gift for observation and Margaret's gift for reading character, and she saw in Horace Platt a man whose grief was performed rather than felt, a man who was already calculating the value of the 40 acres and the shop full of hand tools before the dirt had settled on the coffin. For 3 months, Horace was pleasant. He moved into the house with Lenora and Gerald, and he told Ilara she was welcome to stay as long as she liked, that this was her home and always would be. But within weeks he had begun selling Thomas's tools. The draw knife first, then the spokeshaves, then the chisels one by one, and finally the number 4 smoothing plane with the rosewood handle, which he sold to a man passing through town for $2.50. Ilara found the empty space on the bench where the plane had sat, and she stood there for a long time with her hand on the wood where the tool had rested, feeling the faint impression it had left in the surface, and she did not cry. But something inside her went very still and very cold. She asked Horace about the plane, and he told her it was his property now, that Thomas had left no will, that as Catherine's closest living relative, he was the rightful heir to everything, and that she should be grateful he was letting her sleep under a roof at all. The land went next. Horace sold the 40 acres to a cattle company for a price so low that the clerk at the land office asked him twice if he was certain. He sold the house and the shop separately to a man who wanted the lumber. He sold everything Thomas Wynne had spent 20 years building, and he did it in less than 6 weeks. And when it was done, he had a stack of bills that he counted each evening at the kitchen table while Alara sat in the next room and listened to the sound of paper against his fingers. She did not know about the Harlan Ridge property. Thomas had never mentioned it to her directly, and the personal ledger where he had written for E was in a drawer that Horace had emptied and burned on the second day. Not because he knew what was in it, but because he burned everything he considered clutter. The acre and a half on the north face of the ridge had been overlooked by Horace entirely. It was not listed in the county's active tax rolls. The cabin was condemned, and the property was worth so little that no one had thought to mention it. It sat there on the ridge, forgotten by everyone except the man who had built it and the land itself, waiting. The morning Alara was cast out was a Thursday in early April. She came downstairs to find her belongings packed into a canvas sack and set beside the front door. Lenora was in the kitchen and did not look up. Gerald was on the porch, whittling a stick with a knife that had belonged to Thomas. Horace was standing in the hallway with his coat on, as though he were the one leaving, and he spoke to her without meeting her eyes. "We've made arrangements," he said. "There's a family in town, the Burdens, who need a kitchen girl. I've told them you'll come today." Alara looked at the sack on the floor. It contained her clothes, her father's Bible, the leather coin purse with $43 inside it, and the bone-handled knife Margaret had given her. It did not contain a single one of her father's tools, because there were no tools left to contain. She picked up the sack and put it over her shoulder, and she walked out the front door and down the steps and past Gerald on the porch, and she did not look back, and she did not speak, and she did not go to the Burdens' house because she was not a kitchen girl, and she was not anyone's arrangement. She was Thomas Wynne's daughter, and she knew how to build things, and she walked south out of town on the main road with the morning light on her left shoulder and the weight of everything she owned in the world pressing against her back. She did not go to Margaret because Margaret had died the previous autumn, quietly in her sleep, in the room above the dry goods store, and the store had been taken over by a nephew from Helena, who did not know Ilara's name. She did not go to any of the families in town because she had watched them watch Horace sell her father's life, and none of them had said a word. She walked south because south was the direction the road went, and because the morning was clear and the air was cold and clean and smelled of pine sap and snowmelt, and because walking was something she could do without anyone's permission. The road followed the valley floor for 6 miles before it began to climb. Ilara walked steadily, not fast, her boots finding the ruts where wagon wheels had packed the mud into something almost solid. The mountains rose on both sides, dark with timber, their upper ridges still white with the last of the winter snow. She could hear the creek running somewhere to her left, high and fast with melt, and she could hear the wind in the tops of the ponderosa pines, that particular sound that is not quite a whisper and not quite a roar, but something in between, something that sounds like the world breathing. A red-tailed hawk circled above the tree line, tilting on the thermals, and she stopped to watch it for a moment, because her father had taught her that you should always stop for a hawk, that a hawk in the air is a reminder that the world is larger than your trouble. By midday, she had climbed out of the lower valley and into the transitional country, where the ponderosas gave way to Douglas fir, and the soil turned darker, and the light filtered through the canopy in long diagonal shafts, that looked almost solid enough to touch. She ate a piece of dried bread from her sack and drank from a spring that came out of a mossy rock face beside the road. The water so cold, it made her teeth ache. She could see Harlan Ridge ahead of her now, a long, dark spine of rock and timber running east to west across the head of the valley. And something about the shape of it, the way it sat against the sky like the back of a sleeping animal, made her feel a thing she could not name, a pull that was not quite recognition and not quite memory, but something older than both. She reached the crossroads at the base of the ridge in the late afternoon. There was a general store there, a low building with a tin roof and a porch that sagged in the middle, and a man sitting on the porch in a cane-backed chair with a ledger open on his knee. His name was Asa Drummond, and he was 67 years old, and he had run the store for 31 years, and he knew every piece of property on every ridge and in every hollow within 20 miles. Ilara climbed the porch steps and asked if he knew of any land for sale. Anything at all. Anything a person could buy for less than $50. Asa looked at her for a long time. He looked at her boots, which were good boots, well made, the kind a craftsman would own. He looked at her hands, which were calloused in the particular pattern that comes from years of working wood. He looked at the sack on her shoulder and the set of her jaw and the way she stood, which was the way a person stands when they have decided something and will not be talked out of it. "There's a condemned parcel on the north face," he said. "Acre and a half. Cabin's no good. Root cellars caved in on one side. County wants $40 for it just to clear the books. Nobody's wanted it in years." He paused. The man who built the cabin up there was a woodworker, name of Wynne. Ilara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically, but in some deeper way, as though the world had just rearranged itself around a truth she had not known she was looking for. She said, "I'll take it." Asa studied her face. "You know the name?" "He was my father," Ilara said, and it was the first time she had spoken those words to anyone since Thomas died, and they came out steady and clear, and she was not ashamed of the way her voice held, because it held the way her father had taught her to hold a chisel, firm, deliberate, without apology. Asa Drummond drew up the paperwork himself, a single page in careful script, and Ilara counted out $40 from the leather coin purse and signed her name, and the land was hers. She had $3 left. Asa gave her directions, a trail that switchbacked up the north face through heavy timber, about 1.25 miles. The cabin at the top where the ridge leveled off into a small bench of flat ground before dropping away again on the far side. He told her to watch for the stone chimney, that it was the only thing still standing straight. She thanked him and walked out and began to climb. The trail was narrow and overgrown with alder and young fir, and in places it had washed out entirely, so that she had to pick her way across bare rock and exposed root. The light was failing as she climbed, the sun already behind the ridge, and the air grew colder with each switchback, and the timber grew thicker, and the silence grew deeper until the only sounds were her own breathing and the crunch of her boots on the packed needles and the occasional call of a varied thrush somewhere in the canopy above. That single haunting note that sounds like a question no one has ever answered. She climbed for 40 minutes, and then the trail leveled and the trees opened and she saw it. The cabin sat on a bench of flat ground, perhaps 60 feet wide, backed against a granite outcrop on the uphill side and open to the valley on the downhill side. It was small. She would later measure it at 14 feet by 16 feet. And it was built of hand-hewn logs that had been fitted with the kind of tight, careful notching that she recognized immediately as her father's work. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side. the ridgepole broken where a fir had fallen across it years ago, and the logs on that side were dark with rot where water had been getting in. But the west wall and the south wall were sound, the logs still tight in their notches, the chinking still holding in places, and the stone chimney rose straight and plumb from the center of the structure, built of creek stone mortared with a lime mix that had held against decades of freeze and thaw. The door was gone, just an opening with the leather hinges still nailed to the frame, stiff and curled with age. She stepped through. The interior was dim and smelled of damp wood and earth and something else, something faintly sweet that she would later identify as the dried remains of wild mint that had grown up through the broken floorboards. The floor was wide planks of ponderosa pine, hand-planed, and most of them were still solid despite the years of exposure. The hearth was a broad, flat stone, perhaps 3 feet by 4 feet, set level with the floor and blackened with the soot of old fires. There was a shelf on the west wall, still attached, holding nothing. There was a peg rail near the door with 2 wooden pegs remaining, and there was, against the south wall beneath the one window that still had its frame intact, a simple bench built into the wall, a sitting bench with a storage compartment beneath it, the lid warped but still hinged with wooden pins. She recognized the joinery. She recognized the proportions. She recognized the way the edge of the lid had been chamfered with a block plane. That particular gentle bevel that her father put on everything he built because he believed that nothing should have a sharp edge where a hand might rest. She sat on the bench and looked out through the open doorway at the valley below. The last light was draining from the sky, and the mountains across the valley were turning the color of bruised plums, and the first stars were appearing above the ridgeline. She had $3 and a condemned cabin and an acre and a half of steep, rocky ground that nobody in the world wanted. She had no tools except a folding knife. She had no food except half a piece of dried bread. She had no plan except to be here, in this place her father had built with his own hands for reasons she did not yet understand, and to begin. The hearthstone was cold beneath her feet. The walls smelled of him, not literally, not after all these years, but in the way that a craftsman's work always carries something of the person who made it, some residue of intention and care that outlasts the physical presence of the maker. She opened the coin purse and looked at the $3 inside it, and then she closed it and held it against her chest, and sat in the gathering dark in her father's cabin and breathed. She woke at first light with the cold settled deep in her muscles and the sound of the creek somewhere below the bench. A thin, bright sound that threaded through the timber and found her where she lay on the plank floor with her coat pulled over her shoulders and the canvas sack beneath her head. She lay still for a moment and let the cabin come into focus around her. The square of pale sky in the window frame, the black column of the chimney rising above her, the warped bench against the south wall, the broad hearthstone with its decades of soot. She sat up and pulled the bone-handled knife from her coat pocket and opened it and closed it. Not because she needed it, but because the weight of it in her hand was a familiar thing, and familiar things were scarce. Then she stood and began to look at the cabin the way her father had taught her to look at any piece of work, not at what was wrong with it, but at what was still true. The west wall was true. The south wall was true. The chimney was true. The hearthstone was level and uncracked, a single slab of gray granite that must have taken Thomas and at least one other man to carry up the ridge and set in place. She knelt beside it and ran her fingers along its edges, feeling the way it sat in the floor frame, and she noticed something that made her stop. The hearthstone was not mortared in. Every other stone in the chimney base was set in lime mortar, tight and permanent. But the hearthstone itself was simply resting in a frame of squared timbers, fitted so precisely that it appeared fixed, but was in fact sitting on its own weight alone. She pressed her fingers into the gap between the stone and the timber frame and felt the faintest give, the smallest suggestion of movement, and her heart began to beat in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She knew her father's work. She knew what it meant when Thomas Wynne made something that looked permanent, but was designed to be lifted. She went outside and found a length of fallen branch, hard and dry, about 3 feet long and thick enough to serve as a lever. She brought it back inside and worked the narrow end into the gap between the hearthstone and the frame, carefully, the way her father had taught her to pry. Not with force, but with patience, finding the angle, letting the lever do the work. The stone resisted for a moment, and then shifted, a 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch, and she repositioned the lever and pried again, and the stone tilted up on one edge, and she caught it with her hands and walked it upright and leaned it against the chimney base. Beneath where the hearthstone had rested was a cavity in the earth, lined on all 4 sides and on the bottom with hand-fitted cedar planks, and the cavity was perhaps 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, and inside it were 3 things. The first was a tin box, the kind used for storing tea or tobacco, about 8 inches long and 5 inches wide, with a hinged lid that had been sealed with beeswax around the seam. The second was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather cord. The third was a folded piece of paper, heavy stock, the kind used for letters meant to last, and it was sitting on top of the tin box as though it had been placed there with the expectation that it would be the first thing found and the first thing read. Ilara knelt beside the cavity and looked at these objects for a long time without touching them. The cedar lining was still fragrant, faintly after all the years, but unmistakably cedar. And she understood that her father had chosen cedar because cedar resists moisture and insects and decay, because cedar is what you use when you are storing something you intend to survive you. She picked up the letter first. It was written in her father's hand, that careful, angular script she knew as well as her own. The letters formed with the same precision he brought to everything. No flourishes, no wasted strokes. Every word set down with intention. The paper was yellowed, but the ink was still dark and legible, and she read it there on her knees in the morning light that came through the open doorway of the cabin he had built. To my daughter Ilara, or to whoever finds this and needs it, the letter began. My name is Thomas Wynne. I am a woodworker. I built this cabin in my 24th year, the year I came to this valley, and I am writing this letter in my 32nd year, the year my daughter was born and my wife Catherine died. I do not know when this letter will be found, or by whom, but I am writing it because a man should leave something behind that explains what he intended. And what I intend is this: that the person who finds this place and takes the trouble to lift this stone should have what is beneath it. Because anyone who looks that carefully at the world deserves what careful looking reveals. Inside the tin box, you will find $214 in gold coin. I have saved this over 8 years of work, a little at a time, and I have put it here rather than in the bank in town, because banks fail and fires burn and people take what is not theirs, but the earth keeps what you give it. Inside the oilcloth you will find a ring that belonged to my wife Catherine. It is a plain gold band, and it is the most valuable thing I own, not because of the gold, but because of the hand that wore it. I am leaving it here because I want it to be found by someone who understands that value is not the same as price. If you are my daughter, then I want you to know that I built this cabin for you before you were born, before I knew you were coming. because I believed that a person should always have a place to go that belongs to them and to no one else. I did not know then that you would be a girl, or that your mother would die, or that I would raise you alone. But I knew that the world is not always kind, and that a place of your own is the one thing that cannot be taken from you as long as you know where it is. I am sorry if I am not there to show you. I am sorry if you had to find it alone. But you are here, and that means you and that means you are the person I raised you to be. Build something good here. I love you without condition and without end. Your father, Thomas Wynne. Ilara read the letter twice. She folded it and held it against her chest, and she sat on the floor of the cabin, and she did not cry. Not because she was hard, or because she had been taught not to, but because what she felt was too large and too quiet for tears. It was the feeling of being found. She opened the tin box, and inside were gold coins, eagles and half-eagles, stacked in neat columns and wrapped in strips of cloth to keep them from shifting, and she did not count them because the number did not matter yet. What mattered was that her father had thought of her before she existed, had planned for her, had hidden this beneath a stone he knew she would recognize because he had taught her to read his joinery the way other fathers teach their children to read books. She unwrapped the oilcloth bundle, and inside was the ring, a plain gold band worn smooth on the inside from years against skin, and she held it up to the light and looked through it at the valley below, and she put it on her left hand where it fit loosely but where it would stay. She sat with these things for a long time, the letter and the coins and the ring and the smell of cedar rising from the cavity in the floor. And then she stood and went outside and looked at the cabin and the ridge and the timber and the sky. And she began to make a list in her head of everything that needed to be done. The first thing she did was walk back down to Asa Drummond's store. She bought a handsaw, a claw hammer, a box of cut nails, a hatchet, a coil of rope, a tin of linseed oil, a sack of flour, a sack of dried beans, a pound of salt, a pound of coffee, a box of matches, and a wool blanket. She paid with 1 gold eagle, and Asa made change without comment. Though he looked at the coin for a moment longer than necessary, and then looked at her face, and seemed to understand something he did not ask about. She carried everything up the ridge in 2 trips, and by noon she had begun work on the roof. She started by clearing the fallen fir from the east side, cutting it into sections with the handsaw, and rolling the sections off the collapsed roof and down the slope. The ridgepole had broken where the tree struck it, a clean fracture about 4 feet from the east wall, and she could see that the pole was lodgepole pine, straight-grained and sound except at the break. She needed a new ridgepole, or at least a splice, and she spent the afternoon searching the timber around the cabin for a suitable tree. Straight, dry, the right diameter, no twist. She found one standing dead about 200 yards upslope, a lodgepole that had died on its feet and seasoned in the wind, and she felled it with the hatchet. Working slowly, cutting a notch on the downhill side and then a back cut on the uphill side, the way Thomas had taught her when she was 11, and they had cleared timber together for a neighbor's barn. The tree came down clean, and she limbed it and measured it and cut it to length and dragged it to the cabin with the rope, one end over her shoulder, her boots digging into the slope, her breath coming hard in the thin air. It took her 4 days to repair the roof. She spliced the new ridgepole to the old one using a scarf joint secured with wooden pegs she carved from dry fir with her folding knife. And she set new rafters on the east side using poles she cut and peeled and notched into the wall logs. For the roof deck, she split shakes from a cedar log she found half buried in the duff behind the cabin, using the hatchet as a froe and a section of branch as a mallet, turning out rough shakes about 18 inches long and 6 inches wide, that she nailed in overlapping courses from eave to ridge. The work was slow, and her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and bled and hardened into calluses that would remain for the rest of her life. But the roof went on, course by course, and on the evening of the fourth day, she stood inside the cabin and looked up and saw no sky, only cedar, tight and overlapping, and she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as the beginning of home. On the fifth day, a woman appeared on the trail. Her name was Ruth Cotter, and she was 44 years old, and she lived in a cabin 3/4 of a mile south along the ridge with her husband Boyd, who was a farrier, and their 2 half-grown sons. Ruth was carrying a pot of venison stew covered with a cloth, and she set it on the bench inside the door without ceremony and said, "Asa told us someone was up here working. Figured you could use something hot." She looked at the new roof and the fresh shakes and the swept floor, and she nodded once, the way a person nods when they see competence and do not need to comment on it. She left without asking questions and came back 2 days later with a loaf of bread and a jar of pickled beets and her husband Boyd, who looked at the chimney and said, "Mortar's good. Whoever built this new stone?" Ilara said, "My father." Boyd nodded and said nothing else for 20 minutes, and then he said, "I've got a number 4 plane I never use. Rosewood handle. You want it? It's yours." Ilara's hands went still, and she looked at him and she said, "Yes." And the word came out rough, and she turned away and went back to work on the chinking. Over the following weeks, others came. A man named Doss Everly, 51, a retired logger who lived down in the valley, brought a cross-cut saw and helped Ilara mill planks for replacing the rotted floorboards on the east side. He showed her how to set up a pit saw frame between 2 stumps, and they worked opposite ends of the blade for 2 full days, cutting boards from a windfall ponderosa, the sawdust falling between them in a golden curtain. A young woman named Pell Archer, 23, who kept bees on the south slope of the ridge, brought a comb of honey and stayed to help Ilara mix new chinking from lime and sand and horsehair that Boyd Cotter provided. Pell was quiet and precise, and she worked the chinking into the gaps between the logs with a flat stick, the way she worked wax in her hives, with a patience that Ilara recognized as kin to her own. An old man named Fenton Greer, 76, who had been a carpenter in his working years and now spent his days mending chairs and sharpening tools for anyone who asked, walked up the ridge trail one morning with a canvas roll of chisels, 8 of them, various widths, all sharp, and he set them on the bench and said, "These need someone who'll use them." And he sat on a stump outside and watched Ilara work for an hour, and then he walked back down without saying goodbye, because Fenton Greer was not a man who believed in goodbyes. The cabin came together the way a life comes together, not all at once, not according to a plan, but through the accumulation of small, correct decisions made one after another in the right order. Ilara replaced the east floor planks with the boards she and Doss had milled, planing them smooth with Boyd's number 4 plane, which was not her father's plane, but which had the same rosewood handle and the same weight in her hand, and which cut the same sweet curling shavings that fell to the floor like questions answered. She built a new door from 3 wide boards joined with battens and hung it on iron hinges that Asa Drummond sold her at cost. She rebuilt the bench against the south wall, keeping the original frame her father had made, but replacing the warped lid with a new one she cut and planed and chamfered with the same gentle bevel Thomas had used, because some things should be carried forward exactly as they were. She chinked every gap in every wall. She oiled every log with linseed until the wood darkened and glowed. She cleared the root cellar of its collapsed earth and shored it with new timbers and lined the shelves with cedar planks and filled it with the food she bought with her father's gold. sacks of flour and beans and rice, jars of preserved fruit that Ruth Cotter taught her to put up, crocks of sauerkraut, strings of dried venison. By midsummer, the cabin was whole. It was not large and it was not fine, but it was tight and warm and dry, and every joint in it was honest, and every surface had been touched by hands that cared about what they were making. Ilara planted a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope below the bench, turning the thin soil with a mattock Doss Everly lent her. Working in compost she made from kitchen scraps and forest duff, planting seeds that Pell Archer gave her from her own stock, beans and squash and turnips and herbs. She split firewood and stacked it against the north wall in cords so straight and tight that Fenton Greer, passing by one afternoon, stopped and looked at them and said, "Your father teach you that?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Good man," and kept walking. People began to know her name, not because she introduced herself or sought attention, but because she was there, on the ridge, working, and because the work was visible and the work was good. Ruth Cotter brought her into the rhythm of the ridge. The Saturday gatherings at the Cotters' cabin where the families shared food and news. The trading of labor that was the economy of the place. The unspoken understanding that you helped your neighbors not because you expected help in return, but because helping was what made you a neighbor. Ilara repaired a chair for Isa Drummond, rebuilt a window frame for Pell Archer, sharpened tools for Fenton Greer when his hands grew too stiff to hold the stone steady. She was quiet, and she worked hard, and she did not tell her story to anyone because she did not need to. The story was in the cabin, in the garden, in the wood shavings that curled from the plain, in the way she stood on the ridge in the evening light and looked out at the valley with the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they intend to stay. On an evening in late August, with the garden producing and the root cellar full and the chimney drawing clean and the new door swinging true on its iron hinges, Ilara sat on the bench her father had built, and she had rebuilt, and she looked out through the window at the valley below. The light was amber, and the mountains were turning violet, and the creek was a silver thread in the dark timber, and the hawk was circling, the same hawk or its descendant, tilting on the thermals above the tree line. On the bench beside her were two objects: the bone-handled knife Margaret Soren had given her on her 12th birthday, and the plain gold ring that had belonged to her mother Catherine, found beneath a hearthstone her father had set with his own hands 20 years before. Two objects from two people who had loved her, one who had known her and one who had died before knowing her, both left behind so that she would carry something of them forward into whatever life she built. She thought about Thomas, about the letter, about the sentence that had stayed with her since the morning she read it on her knees in the doorway. Anyone who looks that carefully at the world deserves what careful looking reveals. She thought about Horace Platt, who had sold 40 acres and a lifetime of tools for a fraction of their worth, because he could not see what they were worth, because he measured value only in what could be counted and carried away. She thought about the acre and a half on the north face of Harlan Ridge that nobody had wanted, the steep rocky ground, the condemned cabin, the collapsed root cellar, the property the county assessor had crossed off the books. And she understood now why her father had bought it, and why he had built here, and why he had hidden what he'd hidden. Not because the land was valuable in any way the world recognized, but because it was a place that would be overlooked, a place that would wait, a place that would keep its secrets until the right person came looking. He had known her before she was born. He had known that she would be the kind of person who looked carefully. He had built this place the way he built everything, with patience, with precision, with love that did not announce itself but simply held. Ilara Wynne was 19 years old. She had been cast out of her father's house with $43 and a canvas sack, and no family who would claim her. She had walked south on a spring morning with nothing but the clothes on her back and a knife in her pocket, and the memory of a man who had taught her that patience was not the absence of action, but the presence of attention. She had spent $40 on an acre and a half of land that nobody wanted, a condemned cabin on a ridge that the county had forgotten. And beneath the hearthstone of that cabin, she had found $214 in gold, a letter written in her father's hand, and her mother's wedding ring. She had rebuilt the cabin with her own hands, and the help of people who became her neighbors, and then became her community, and then became something that did not have a name, but that felt, when she sat among them on Saturday evenings with the fire going, and the coffee hot, and the conversation low and easy, like the thing she had been walking toward her whole life. It was the best $40 she ever spent.